This video tutorial will look at the lean production technique of critical path analysis. So what is critical path analysis? Well, let's start with a scenario to show you that actually you're probably quite familiar with this. Now I'm down at Wembley Park with 4 tickets to go and see Torquay United in a rare cup final appearance, and 3 of my friends are going to join me. 1 from Stanmore, 1 from Watford and 1 from Uxbridge. And it just so happened that after finishing what they're doing, they're all leaving home at 6 o'clock. Now I don't actually want to go into the stadium on my own. We want to sit together, so therefore we're not going to go in until everyone has arrived. So I want to find out what time everyone's going to be there for. Now we're going to assume and simplify this and say that a train takes 5 minutes between each station that it stops at. So my first friend, who's leaving from Stanmore, will begin his journey. It'll take 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes for him to arrive from Stanmore at Wembley Park. So 20 minutes. So 20 past 6 he'll be there. My second friend is leaving from Watford. So 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50 minutes later, so 6:50, they arrive at Wembley Park. Now obviously I've got to make sure I'm waiting for those two, but my third friend is also coming from Uxbridge. So again, 5 minutes between stations is 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55 minutes. So my third friend actually takes 55 minutes to arrive at Wembley Park. Again, 5 minutes between stations and leaving at 6 o'clock. So I know that essentially we can't go into the ground till everyone's there, which is going to be at 6:55. First friend took 20 minutes, second friend took 50 minutes, and my third friend took 55. And my first friend's quite savvy, knows we're therefore meeting at 6:55, so could actually leave a little bit later than 6 o'clock. It only takes him 20 minutes. He could leave just after past and still be there in time. So this is critical path analysis used in a daily basis. So let's think about actually what it means and how we're supposed to look at it as part of a business exam. So critical path analysis is a decision-making tool. It's a really key thing to remember. It won't tell you what to do, just the best way of going around completing something. So organising time, money and other resources. Remember, it's lean production, so if we can save on any of those, well, that's all the better. Certainly having resources, employees or equipment that we're hiring sat around for a long time and we're not using it is very, very wasteful. So critical path aims to reduce that. It's time management again, in terms of reducing the amount of wastage and trying to do things in the most efficient way. The aims of critical path, well, it helps us plan complex operations. Certainly critical path analysis or network analysis is used on many big projects. It was used at the London Olympics. It would have been used for Heathrow Terminal 5, any number of large projects to manage the different parts of it. It also helps us to illustrate the order of activities, so in what sequence we need to do things. To identify when we can start something, so when something else finishes. So my example, we could actually wait for 3 people to arrive. 60:55 was the last person, so therefore that's when we could then go into the stadium. So allowing for that allows us to know when we can continue with something else. It also tells us which of those activities is critical. So my friend coming from Stanmore and Watford, they had a little bit of spare time. The person coming from Uxbridge, if they were delayed, well actually we'd be delayed full stop, so 5 minutes extra on their journey meant we couldn't start until 7 o'clock. The person from Watford would begin at 6:50, so 5 minutes delay for them, we'd still be at 6:55. And finally, it allows us to identify opportunities so we can actually reallocate resources. So if we know something is critical, we can see if we've got activities that are less critical and reallocate some of the resources, manpower, machinery to some of those critical tasks to try and shorten the task even further and the whole project. So let's have a look at a network diagram. Now network diagrams actually contain the network analysis, the critical path if you like, that we're going to be developing and looking at. Now the reason we need to know these are really threefold. Number 1, we may be asked to construct a network diagram. Number 2, you might be asked to make changes to an existing network diagram and consider the impacts. Or number 3, you might be asked simply to interpret information, identify issues with a network diagram. The one you can see here has 2 very simple components. You have the node, which is repeated at either end of the activity being the arrow and the node being those circles. So let's have a look at the activity arrow first. There's 2 bits of information that it will contain. The first is actually the details of what the activity is. Now we could write this longhand, however on a very complex diagram this can look very messy and look very confusing. So it's often abbreviated to a letter, in this case A. At the side of your network diagram you might find that there's a table that explains what activity A is. As well as what activity is, we also need to know how long it will last. Now I haven't put a time frame explicitly on here, but this could be 5 days, 5 weeks, perhaps 5 months. Most commonly, you're likely to see days or weeks. This is important to know so we realise how long our tasks are going to take and therefore our whole project. The circles as mentioned are nodes, so nodes are our start point, our finish points, and they have a reference number. We're never going to use this for calculation. We may as well write ONE for 1 rather than the digit number 1. So that's our first half of the node. In the first quarter circle, we then put the earliest start time. So this is the point at which we can then start the subsequent activity, so activity A. Now it's put as 0 rather than the time, 6 o'clock or 17th of June, because this is how far past immediately now we can actually start. So 0 means we can start this immediately, there's no delay. We'll also have the latest finish time. This is the time that the previous task must finish. We don't have a previous task here, we're actually on the first node, node 1. Again, we want this to be 0 in this case because we don't want to delay starting activity A. So let's think about how this might work. Now I've got an example of a very simplistic task of making a cup of mint tea. I've gone for mint tea to avoid the hassle of whether we put the milk in first, tea bag out first, or when we put sugar in. So I've gone for some mint tea. So if we look, I've broken it into 5 stages on the table on the right. So we need to put the kettle on, which I'm suggesting might take 3 minutes. This is task A. Get a suitable cup from the cupboard, might take us 1 minute, that's task B. Task C is to put the cup in the mug, 1 minute. D is to pour the hot water on, 2 minutes, and E finally is to remove the tea bag and enjoy, again 1 minute. Now some of these tasks can be done simultaneously. As an individual, if we put the kettle on, we would have that 3 minutes to actually then go and get our cup and put the bag in the cup, for example. So there's no prerequisites for us to actually go and to get a cup as long as the kettle is on. However, hot water, pouring that into our cup, we need both the water to be hot, so the kettle boiled, as well as the cup and the tea bag in there so we can actually infuse. So some of these tasks require other things to be done first. These are called prerequisites. If you look at the diagram, node 1 is our starting point. We can actually start both task A and B immediately. So there's an arrow coming straight out. Again, you'll see activity A, put the kettle on, 3 minutes. Activity B, get to the cup, 1 minute. And once we've got the cup, we can then put a bag in the cup, so that's activity C. Now, all of those activities need to be complete before we start task D, which is actually pouring the hot water. If we don't complete it, we're going to pour tepid water on our tea bag and cup, or we're just going to pour hot water on the worktop. So we must complete those activities, so you'll notice they come back together before we start activity D. After that, we have activity E, and then we have a node at the end of activities to show that that is the finish point of the entire task or project. So let's think about what some of these numbers mean and actually how we're going to fill this in. So the earliest start time is the top quarter of our node. And there's a way that we calculate it which is really simple. So to work out the earliest start time of the next activity, so for node 2, where we'd work out our earliest start time for task B, we take the earliest start time of the previous activity and then we add the activity duration. So if you have a look at the diagram, 0, shown in red, plus 5 equals 5, which is shown in blue. So the earliest time we can start activity B would be after 5 minutes in this example. We can see this, we need to get A done first, which takes 5 minutes. Same again for B. So to work out the earliest start time in node 3, 5 was the previous earliest start time of node 2, plus the 3, which obviously gives us 8. So we're just adding up as we go along. Now our first golden rule is the earliest start time works from left to right. So let's put this into our example. So we start with node 1 always an earliest start time of 0. There's nothing happening before it, so we can start straight away. Now let's work out activity B first of all. So activity B takes 1 minute. So 0 plus 1 equals 1. Very straightforward. This means we can start activity C 1 minute after the start of the entire project. However, we have a complication here. For node 3, what do we put as the earliest start time? We know we need to boil the kettle and get the cup with the bag in it before we start. So when do we start? Well, let's think about the numbers again. So activity A, we can start it immediately, it takes 3 minutes. So after exactly 3 minutes, the kettle is boiled. Using the other pathway, activity B is 1 minute, activity C is 1 minute, so actually we can have that complete after 2 minutes. Now if you think about it, if I try and make my cup of tea and pour my water into my cup of tea bag after 2 minutes, the kettle hasn't boiled. So there's another rule that helps us to calculate the early start time. And that is where we have two activities that come together, for example F and G in this example, both meet at node 5. The figure we pick for the early start time will be the highest calculation of the other routes. So if we look at node 3, the early start time is 10, plus activity F is 3, which is 13. However, node 4, early start time is 12, plus activity G is 5, is 17. So we're going to go for the highest number. 10 plus 3 is 13, 12 plus 5 is 17, so we'll go for the early start time of 17. Obeying that logic, we'll now find that for node 3, the early start time is 3. And that makes sense. We have to wait for the kettle to boil. It takes the longest amount of time. Again, for node 4, 3 plus 2 is 5. And for node 5, 5 plus 1 is 6. So this tells us we can make a cup of tea, mint tea, in 6 minutes. Again, these are very generalized figures, I appreciate. So that's great. So we've done the early start time. Well, what about the final circle, or final part of the circle, which is our latest finish time? Again, there's a little bit of logic involved here, and then you'll find with the whole process, a logical approach means you shouldn't go wrong. So we know that we can finish, for example here, our activity in 8 minutes. Okay, so we're looking at node 3, and the earliest start time, therefore the point at which we can finish, the start to finish, is 8 minutes. So the latest point we want to be finished is 8 minutes. So our red figure here, 8, is exactly the same as the number above it, because we know we can do it in 8 minutes, so why would we want to take any longer? Remember, this is all about lean production and efficiency, so we put an 8 there. So let's work backwards. So this time, you'll see it's all color-coded. We're trying to work out from right to left, and this is actually rule 3. So our blue figure is our latest finish time of our previous activity. So we know that we finish activity A after 5 minutes. That's the latest finish time we need to be there. And we've worked that out by taking the latest finish time of the activity, which is the red number 8, minus its duration, which is 3, which gives us 5. Again, if we continue that along, you'll find that 5, latest finish time of activity A, node 2, take away 5, will give us a 0. So again, that tells us the latest point that we can be starting that next activity, or the latest point the last activity must be completed by. So let's apply this to our example of making tea. So we know that we can complete the whole project, the whole network, in 6 minutes. So therefore our latest finish time will again be 6. Now we're going to take away the 1, which is the duration of task E, removing our tea bag, and that will give us the latest finish time of node 4, 5. Again, the same logic for activity D, going back to node 3, 5 minus 2 is 3. And we go along the bottom route, 3 minus 1 will give us our node 2 answer, which is 2. And now we again have a problem. So from node 3 back to node 1, 3 minus 3 is 0, and node 2, 2 minus 1 is 1. So which figure do we pick? Well, this leaves us with our fourth and final rule. Rule 4, when we've got two activities meeting on our latest finish time, we actually look for the lowest calculated figure. So my example here, we have activity F and G. So moving from node 3 back to node 2, 14 in red minus 3 is 11, and 18 minus 5 is 13. So we're going to go for the lowest number, as essentially if we left the latest finish time in node 2 is 13, it means that we're allowing the previous activity, presumably E, to finish slightly later, which would then upset activity F. So we're going to go for the lowest figure this time. So how will that look? Well, very simply, 3 minus 3 is 0, 2 minus 1 is 1, the lowest figure is of course 0. And it is a general rule with critical path analysis that the very first node will be node 1 with an earliest start time and a latest finish time of 0, 0. So that's great, we've got our network together. There's something called float we need to consider. Now float is any spare time that we might have in our network. Some tasks can be started later than the early start time without impacting the the whole project. If you remember earlier, my friend coming from Stanmore, only took him 20 minutes, he left at 6 o'clock, he'd be there by 6:20, and everyone else wouldn't have finished arriving until 6:55. So it was actually 35 minutes that he'd be hanging around. Now that information is useful. He could have decided to leave later, he could have decided to get some food, or could just have been early to keep me company. So this spare time is known as the float, and total float is what we're using in this example. So for a business, we want to think about how we could use resources during those activities that have float. So could we take resources away and put them elsewhere to actually reduce the length of the whole project? So how do we calculate float? Again, I've left unshaded the numbers we're going to be using, and I've color-coded them hopefully to make them a little bit easier to look at. So float time is the latest finish time of an activity, again shown here in blue, so activity A has to be completed by 5. Take away the duration of the activity, again activity A takes 5. Take away the earliest start time of that activity, so 0. So our calculation, the float time for this activity is 5 minus 0, which actually is 0. So this means there is no float. This task is critical. If it's delayed, it will actually not have a knock-on impact on all of the tasks that come afterwards. A second example, let's have a look at this one. So the same calculation. The latest finish time of this activity is 5. Take away the activity duration 3. Take away the earliest start time of the activity, which is 0. 5 minus 3 is 2. Minus 0 is still 2. So this task A would actually have 2 minutes float. This is 2 minutes of spare time that we could be using for other things, or at least allocating resources. So let's calculate the float on our example. We're going to go through each activity in turn, starting with activity A. So again, I've left unshaded the numbers either end of activity A that we're concerned with. So the latest finish time of activity A is 3. Take away the duration, 3, which is 0. Take away 0, remains 0, but there's no float in activity A. Activity B. The latest finish time is 2. Take away the duration, 1. Take away the earliest start time, 0. 2 minus 1 is 1. Take away nothing, leaves us with 1. Activity C. Our latest finish time is 3. Our duration is 1, so that's 2. Take away the earliest start time, which is 1. So again, that leaves us with 1 as a float period. Activity D. 5 minus 2 minus 3 is 0. And finally, activity E. Latest finish time of 6. Take away duration of 1. Take away the earliest start time of 5. Leaves us with 0. So there's a couple of conclusions we can make here. Both tasks B and C have a float of 1 minute. I could actually take much longer meandering across my kitchen. It must be a very big kitchen. And if it took me 2 minutes to go and get my cup, actually that wouldn't impact. I could still make my cup of herbal tea in 6 minutes. And the same for task C. Obviously if task B did take longer, that would then eliminate the float from task C because the earliest start time would have increased for node 2. We also know the critical path, therefore, the activities that we can't delay are activities A, D and E. Any delay on any of these will alter that final latest finish time on node 5. How do you show that a task is critical? Well, very simply, you'll see here I've put a couple of red crosses through the tasks that are actually critical. So it shows us these ones that can't be delayed. In an exam, if there was likely to be any changes to those activities, the whole project would fall behind. If there was changes to task B or C, as long as there was sufficient float, I would obviously recalculate my early start time, latest finish times, then actually I wouldn't have a problem. So let's sum this up. What are the advantages of critical path analysis? Well, the aim of it is to minimize our loss of time to maximize efficiency and use of time. We can work out what activities can happen simultaneously, and again, which activities we can actually do simultaneously or move resources around from to improve our use of time. Obviously, time in business, it's a big cliche, is money. But if you've got resources and workers sat on standby, we have to pay those and pay for them. So therefore, it's going to reduce our costs in terms of paying for those resources. It can be useful in terms of cash flow. Certainly, business will know when it's likely to have cash outflows. So a very complicated project might see that a significant investment needs to be made after 70 weeks, in which case, by looking at this, we can find out and plan for cash flow in that period. We can also look for potential problems. in implementing our operations, we may see that actually something's going to change, and if it's liable to change, what impact it's going to have. We can also see for a project, if I need to make a cup of tea, for example, in 5 minutes, the fact I can't do it any time quicker than 6 minutes, so therefore that will allow me to rethink. And equally, it will show us when and where we need resources. So again, for a business, we're applying a new piece of equipment, and we work out how long it takes us to remove the old equipment, repair and reinstall. I know when I need to get employees in, so I can get them trained up on the equipment, because I'll have an exact idea of how long, how far through the path that's going to take. There are some disadvantages to critical path analysis. It might have limited usefulness in particularly complex operations. So if you've got a number of factors that you're actually trying to account for, and we've just made it very simple today, then actually it may lose accuracy. If one or two activities aren't calculated correctly, then actually it'll throw the whole network analysis out and significantly change both critical tasks and durations. Obviously, clear and reliable information. Often in an exam, you might find the person who's put forward a proposal, a strategy that the business should take, is the person who's designed the critical path. And very often they're not someone with much of an operations background. So reliability might be an issue, equally there may be some bias there. To get it to work, there needs to be a lot of good communication, and actually there needs to be some teamwork in actually making sure it does work. Certainly there may be things in a project that are marketing based and finance and human resources and operations, so those different faculties and functions, need to make sure they work together properly. And finally, do think about reliability of data. A project which is several years in advance, or a project which has never been undertaken by a business before, is likely to have less reliable and less accurate information. Also, again, think about who's created it. Is there some bias that you could tease out of it? So that's critical path analysis, and hopefully you're feeling a bit clearer.